let's look at understanding the multiplication of fractions. Here I have listed two fraction problems where we're multiplying two fractions together, and there's two ways really to show our work. In this first one, you can see here I have 2/3 times 5/7 equals, you take your 2 times 5 and you can put that on the top, and then you put your denominators on the bottom, 3 times 7. What you get here is 2 times 5 gives me our 10, and the 3 times 7 gives us 21. Now another way to show your work is shown here with our problem 9/10 times 6/7. What you see here is you can just draw an arrow, and eventually, or sometimes you don't even have to draw the arrow. You just know to multiply straight across, and you get 9 times 6 is 54, and 10 times 7 is 70. Now in this case, what I then challenge you to do is we need to start to look at simplifying. So if we simplify this, I can simplify this by dividing by 2 over 2, which is the same as 1. So if I take half of 54 is 27, and then half of 70 is 35. So here are two ways that you can show your work for multiplying fractions. Now, let's check out a few of these problems. So here I have 2/5 times 3/4. So what I'm going to do is, you can multiply straight across, and you get 6/20, or I can simplify that by dividing the top and bottom by 2, since they're both even, and I get 3/10. My next one here, I have 2/5 times 7/7. Okay, before I multiply straight across, let's take a look at this. This 7/7 is another way to say 1. So rather than multiplying it out, I'm basically saying, what is 2/5 times 1? Well, I know it's going to be 2/5, which, if I would have multiplied it out, I would have had 14 over 35, and then I would have had to divide by that same 7/7. So I was able to save myself all of this work by realizing that if you multiply a fraction by 1, it will stay the same. And our last question here on this side is 2/5 times 15. Now this is a fraction that I described it as a friendly fraction in the past, where this denominator and this whole number are friendly. They're in the same fact family. So 15, I can actually take and do this one a little differently than the others. I could do this two ways, so I'm going to show both. I can do 15 divided by 5 times 2, which would be 3 times 2 gives me 6, or I could multiply straight across as I did up above and get 30 over 5, and I know that 30 divided by 5 is 6. Either way, we get our answer of 6. These next three problems, I would like you to take a second and try yourself. Just hit pause, and then hit play and see how your answers stack up against mine. Okay, for 12 times 5/6, you can multiply straight across, or like we did down here, you could do the divide and then times it by the numerator. I'm just going to multiply straight across. We get 60 over 6, which gives me 10. Next, I have 2/3 times 5/6. If I multiply straight across, I get 10/18, which I can simplify by dividing top and bottom by 2 and get 5/9. And the last one here, I have 5/5 times 5 over 6. Oh, before I multiply, it happened again. This fraction equals 1. So instead of multiplying it out and having to simplify, I realize that 5/5 is the same as 1, so 1 times any number is that other number, so I know that my answer stays 5/6. Now let's look a little more carefully at these problems. Up here we started with 2/5. I multiplied by a number less than 1, and I have a smaller answer than what I started with. Over here I started with 2/3. I multiply it by a fraction less than 1, and now I have a smaller answer again than what I started with. So it seems like if you have a number and you multiply it by a fraction less than 1, it looks like we could maybe come up with a rule that says that our answer will get smaller. Now our next one, we can focus the ones that I have the big gigantic 1 in there. If you multiply a fraction times 1, your answer stays the same, which you can see is exactly what happened here and in this one over here. And in the two remaining problems, you'll probably find it is no surprise if you have a fraction and you multiply it by a number bigger than 1, your answer is going to be bigger. So now let's take that and apply that to our rules. The first rule is, so any number times a fraction less than 1. So here I have a fraction less than 1, or I have a fraction, and I'm multiplying by a fraction less than 1. I can multiply straight across. I get 6/12, or I can write that as a half. So it looks like, and based on what we just did before, I could say my answer will be smaller than the original fraction or number. So our next statement is, any number times 1 will, well, a whole number times 1 is the other whole number, and a fraction times 1 is that fraction. So we could say any number times 1 will be the other number. So for our last statement, we have any number times a fraction more than 1. I took 3/5, which is our original, and I multiplied it by 6/5. So I got 18/25. I took the time to compare them to see my original again, 3/5, and my 18/25, and I found that indeed the new one was larger. So I finished off the statement, any number times a fraction more than 1 will lead to an answer larger than the original. So the quickest way to paraphrase these rules would be, if we start at the top again, any number times a fraction less than 1 will make the fraction smaller. Any number times 1, it will be the same. And any number times a fraction more than 1 will lead to or give me a larger number. Let's do a few practice problems of these before we call it quits. Now let's look at some scenarios, and we're going to answer either true or false. We have 3/5 times 6/7, and that is less than 3/5. So will multiplying 3/5 by 6/7 make it smaller? And this is yes, because 6/7 is smaller than 1. Now what about if I take 6/7 and multiply it by 3/5? Does that make my answer smaller than 6/7? That is also true, because the key for this is both fractions, both numbers are smaller than 1, so they're going to make the other one smaller. Because they're less than 1, it only makes sense. Now let's look at this next one here. We have 5/8 times 9/9 is the same as 5/8, and that would be true because 9/9 is 1. So it's going to stay 5/8. Now what about this? Is the same as 9/9. So if you have 9/9 and you multiply it by 5/8, that is less than 1, so that is actually false. It will make it smaller because we're just taking part of that 1. To see, you got to be real careful with these and read what it's saying and really think about questions like this. They can be rather challenging. Our final one, we set up, I have a fraction greater than 1 and a fraction smaller than 1. So carefully look at this. 9/8 times 4/5 is greater than 9/8. So I have to look at the 4/5 for that one. 4/5 will actually make it a little bit smaller, so that is false. And the final one, if I multiply 4/5 times 9/8, since 9/8 is bigger than 1, that will actually make my answer bigger than 4/5, which means it's true. So again, you just have to be very careful with these. You have to think these through. You might even need to answer them to determine if it's making your answer bigger or smaller. But remember, if you multiply by a fraction less than 1, it will make your answer smaller. If you multiply a number or fraction by 1, it keeps it the same. And if you multiply any number by a number larger than 1, it will make your answer bigger. I hope this helps.